designed to encourage, empower, and educate real estate professionals by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati, and this is Calibrate Real Estate. Broadcasting from the Mile High City. Thank you for tuning in to the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati. I appreciate your download. As you know, we are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Download us wherever you want. And I'm so excited to be hanging out with a good buddy of mine. Last time I saw him was face-to-face in South Carolina, but it wasn't Columbia, it was Charleston. And that's a little shout out to Brad Allen. This is Ryan Jancula. Ryan, say hello to our podcast audience.
How we doing out there? Hey, I got my mile high salute there.
There we go, man.
Shout out to Elway.
Do it. Elway and Terrell Davis. So Ryan Jancula is a top producing realtor with Compass, and Compass has taken over the world of real estate, which is a good thing. Compass is definitely doing some awesome stuff. Ryan is a fellow 30 under 30, and he excels in investments, resort, lifestyle real estate, and most importantly, one of the things I want to talk about is prospect by cold calling, something that absolutely strikes fear in a lot of realtors. Before we get into that part of the discussion, Ryan, just let's talk to our audience just about how you got started, when you got your start, who got you interested in working in real estate, and just kind of how your business got started.
Well, absolutely. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me here. So I started out getting my real estate license when I was around 19 years old. I was actually set to head up to college, and I just knew that during that time I was always going to end up in real estate. I had my family, my mother's side, all actually were in the real estate field in Los Angeles, and then I grew up from ages 4 till 14 up in Ashland, Oregon. So I've been back half of my life in Oregon, half of my life down here in Los Angeles, and then I went back up to school for University of Oregon, so I'm a big Duck fan. And with all that said, I just knew that I was going to come back and get into real estate. My grandmother was a top selling real estate agent for Fred Sands Realtors out here in Los Angeles, which is a really well-known name that ended up selling to, I think, Coldwell Banker in 20, 30 years ago. She stopped selling real estate in 1990, but I heard these stories that my mother would tell me about how successful she was. And that was kind of an overlay of me knowing that I kind of had the charisma, I kind of had that kind of self-competitiveness to be successful in this field. So that's kind of why I went into it.
What a cool story. So I was reading through your bio, and your grandma, Nadine McNulty, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So it showed here that she retired in 90, but started in 1969. And for those that are, first of all, I wasn't born in 1969, and I've heard from a lot of people that have been in the business that long, or new people. 1960s, being a woman as a realtor was actually not a commonality. Most of the realtors that we see today, it's something like 60 to 65% of the realtors in the National Association of Realtors are female, but that was not the case in the 60s. It was a male dominated. There was a lot of scrutiny about people, whether you wear, pantsuits or a dress, and especially depending on what section of the country you're working in. She was definitely a pioneer is what I'm trying to get to. And how cool to have that type of influence as your grandma, and then have your mom share those stories. Got to be really, really neat for you to be able to carry on that tradition.
No, it was awesome. Unfortunately, I didn't really get to ever see her in action, but I still hear stories now of some of my clients, or, I'll go ahead, let's say off of a cold call, I'll have a conversation with someone who said, I've been living in the Palisades for 50 years. And then I'll just bring up my grandmother's name, and they'll say, 50 years ago, your grandmother actually sold us the house that we're living in. I just actually leased out my aunt and uncle's place that's in the Palisades, and the house that my uncle and my mother grew up in, they're actually living in, and it's on the market right now. And so I was able to go over there the other weekend and actually walk the house that my grandfather had built, which was a really, really cool thing. So now I've actually got the original plan. So it's a family lineage, but to get down into more of like the details of it, when I went to Malibu High School, and I was going to school with a lot of very, very affluent kids, and we didn't really grow up with too much in terms of means. I mean, we were fine off, but we definitely were making it by. Of course, living in Malibu was not a bad thing, but you got the beach there and everything. But I had a really great friend, and his dad was a wonderful mentor to me, one of my first mentors, and he actually paid for my real estate books, which was awesome. So he said, hey, you know what? I'm going to pay for real estate books. Go ahead and get your license. And so I was able to do that at age 20. I passed the test. And I didn't get back into actual real estate until I was 22 because I finished up college at the University of Oregon. But I owe a lot to him for believing in me at that point in time and investing, which I was actually able to take on and give back a little bit as I created my career. I created an internship program where I actually had about 20 different people come through where I paid for the real estate licenses and kind of gave back as Tony Doran did to me.
That's a cool story about Tony. Is that something that he totally surprised you with? I mean, I just would love to dive deep into that for just a second. Is that something you expected, or how did he share that? Like, hey, I'm gonna do this for you.
Well, sitting at the dinner table with him, and then his sons and whatnot, I'd always just pick his brain because he was in commercial real estate, and we would have these long conversations. And he knew that I was taking a liking to it, and he kind of knew that of the history of what my family had been very successful in the past. And he just kind of saw something in me where he's like, okay, you know what, I'm going to invest in you to get that. It seems like that's something that you want, and you seem pretty sure about it. And I said, yes. So it was a really amazing opportunity.
Yeah. And it's, I'd done an interview before with one of our fellow 30 under 30s, Rachel Adler, and she had mentioned that mentors, a lot of it is just about someone believing in you and giving you a shot. And that's really a lot of times all someone needs to do for you to just have a different career trajectory, which is then you go to the highest of highs. And Tony, I'm sure, was super proud of you. You're announced as one of Realtor Magazine's 30 under 30. You're one of the newer classes here just in the last couple of years. What was that experience like? But then also importantly, what were some of the ingredients to that success that you felt like, man, really led you to being recognized by Realtor Magazine?
Well, I think I was just watching a video Jack Ma was saying of, Alibaba. He was saying that the first thing that you should do when you get out of school is to find someone to learn from. And that should be your first duty. You shouldn't worry about the money. You shouldn't worry about any of that. You should learn as much as you possibly can from a mentor. So when I actually got out of college, I graduated with my business administration degree in marketing. I always knew I was going to get back into real estate. And then when I came back down, I had the opportunity to work with a top producing real estate agent in the Pacific Palisades, where I worked as his assistant for 2.5 years. And he was my next mentor. He's actually the president of the Beverly Hills Greater Los Angeles Association of Realtors down here now. And Marco Ruffo was another great mentor for me. So I was very lucky to be able to have these people that were somewhat in my life that were able to really teach me the right ways of doing things. And answering your question, Kyle, more so on terms of, the 30 under 30 and how that, how that honor was gained. I think it was really by the persistence that I learned from those mentors of stating, hey, it's persistency and consistency. It's, when I came back down here, I didn't really have too many, friends and family that were buying $2 million, $3 million properties, which were the mean and medium price points up here in the Pacific Palisades. And that was the area that I knew that I learned to really, be good at and have the best knowledge of. And I didn't want to go ahead and go do another area. I wanted to stay in this area that I felt like I had family roots in, and I had, maybe I didn't have any direct connections, but I knew that I could create something because I really, really cared about the community. And through that, persistence and consistency, that's, I think, really the two qualities that have earned me the 30 under 30.
I think it's great. And as a fellow cold caller, and I think we started the interview off saying that that's something that makes people cringe. It's the idea of calling someone completely out of the blue and what in the world do you say? And it's sort of like, you figure like ad-libbing or some, stage acting where it's like, hey, here's a scene and go. And you've just got to kind of roll with the punches. I will say, though, that there's a formula to it, and that's something that we'll dive into. The consistency, the persistency, that is absolutely vital to any business being successful. But if you're going to be working cold leads and then getting those actually materialized into warm leads, you've got to have a system through it. And so as a younger person, I feel like you've got this point where you're like, here's my starting point. Here's the place I'm going to learn. Here's the person I'm going to learn from, like you said. Then you get to this point where you're like, okay, I've now got a system, and it's just about really keeping your numbers up, because I think in prospecting, it is all about a numbers game. And it's not to say you're not going to have valuable relationships. Certainly the relationships come out of it. And I'm seeing that as I've been in the business now 15 years. But let's talk about how to approach cold calling. Let's get really tactical, share some tips, some strategies, ways that you find people's contact information, and just kind of how you approach your business as a prospector and geographic farmer.
Well, I think to the new real estate agents that are freshly licensed that are coming in and saying, I don't have a network, I don't really have much to go off of, how do I create business? A lot of times people will say, okay, well, open houses, or you go ahead and partner up with an agent who's been in the area for a long time and bring them a value proposition. I think the common denominator between all these is value. When you speak to someone, you have to bring that value proposition of what are you doing for them? Because if you're picking up the phone and you're calling someone cold and they're picking up the phone on the other end and they're saying, hello, they want to know, why are you calling them? How can you bring value to them? So I was able to create a lot of value in my area from 2012 all the way up to currently, where I've created a system where I do have cold callers to this day that are able to present a value proposition in an appreciating market where there's a lot of tear down properties or properties that have value add opportunities. And that's how I really created the system. Myself and my partner, who started with me once I left my first mentor, we were able to create this system where we targeted every single house that had deferred maintenance, and we created a whole entire Excel sheet. And then off that Excel sheet, we found all the phone numbers and we filled out that database, and then we started just mining them and calling and saying, hey, would you hear out an offer for your home? And, you call 100 of those people, you got 1,000 of those people. Someone's going to want to hear what you have to say at a certain point, depending upon what happened in their life. Maybe something happened where they're going through a divorce, and that call that you just made is the perfect call that would bring them value. What's great too is when you start to create business, you already have even that much more of a value proposition to hand to people, because you have a listing in the area that sold for this price, and you actually have real buyers that have come through. And like a lot of areas in the United States, but especially in these higher valued areas, the idea of exclusivity and pocket listings are huge here in Los Angeles. So being able to bring something that's an off market, I've been able to be really successful in putting together off market deals where both the seller and the buyer are extremely happy teaming up and actually transacting, where they're both having the terms and the price point ultimately that makes them both feel great.
I agree. I feel like that works in commercial real estate as well, where you get business owners, you get affluent people that either want to be in this sort of non-disclosure or confidentiality type of situation, or just frankly, just don't want to mess with it. They're like, look, I realize that I might not be getting absolute top value for this, but I'm getting pretty darn close, because I know I'm smart enough as the owner. I know I'm smart enough to know kind of what my property's worth, and I'm going to keep Ryan honest here, and he's going to quarterback the transaction. And I'd rather do a deal direct than have all these people go through my really expensive house. If it's something that's really nice, or if it's value add, there might be some appraisal issues, there might be some lending issues. There's reasons why it may make sense to take an offer direct. I have a feeling you've got some stories, because I certainly do too. Now that you've strung together, almost a decade here in your career, you, I'm sure, have some situations that are starting to come to fruition now that started off 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I think for the people that are like, hey man, how do I experience immediate success? What would you suggest to someone that's really starting, to do geographic farming through farming cold leads, because it does take a while?
It's not going to happen fast. I mean, especially when the entry level price point for here, you have extremely sophisticated, very, very smart people, like as you were stating, like that own businesses that have, multi-million-dollar companies, and you're dealing with them, and they want a high level of expertise, knowledge. You need to know your stuff right off the bat. So I think that's the first thing, is really having the whole knowledge and the confidence to be able to, talk to these people and transact with these people.
The thing I really liked about your answer a few minutes ago was that you had shared that once you start to get momentum in a cold area, and that feels like, oh, I want to service warm leads, I want to work with friends and family, and that's good. The problem that I see, especially for new agents, when you're working friends and family and people you went to high school with and went to college with, you're driving all over the city. And if you're in an area like LA, driving all over the city could really, you could go from one appointment to another, and then your whole day is shot. I remember talking to Ivan Estrada, who works in the LA market and is one of our 30 under 30s. And he was sharing, he's like, man, I do everything I can to do things by FaceTime, by phone call, and however I need to, Skype, whatever, where I can be in my office and have people going out to do different things, because LA traffic is a real thing. And so I think that one of the important things that you shared that I'd love to dive deep into is that you get one of these deals to happen, all of a sudden you've got a story to share with everybody on that block, everybody in the neighborhood. And that story might materialize immediately for certain people. And then for others, it may just build on a couple of years worth of contact. But I really feel like you create a more efficient business because you're not all over the place, and you're not working a $500,000 buyer and then a $2 million buyer, and you're like all over. You really are geared into a niche. And I think that adds that value. So what are some of these situations where you're like, man, all of a sudden I sold this house and this house and that house in the same block? Or how does that chain reaction is kind of where I'm going? How does that work?
Yeah, so when I really started off with the business of targeting those houses that had the deferred maintenance, a lot of them have been in families for a long time, and then it's passed along to the trustees or the kids, and then they want to go ahead and put it on the market. A lot of times I wouldn't necessarily have a buyer starting out, so I would go ahead and I'd go down the street to the developer who's tearing down the home down the street, and I'd say, well, that house was bought and sold for this price. What if I can get you, 5% higher than that house sold for? And then by doing that, I was able to bring a buyer in, and obviously there's a lot of comps that have sold on the back end in terms of a lot of the developments in the single family world out here. There's a few companies that are actually doing it and doing extremely successful and huge quantities at one time, where they have a formulaic system of how they can go ahead and execute on these properties to make it profitable while also giving sellers, top dollar. So by advertising, and also I still use a lot of, direct mail. I send out a coming soon, I send out a just listed, I send out a just sold. I have that system set up super firm, where then on top of that, I'm peppering it with cold calls, the door knocks, and then they see your name on the digital advertising that you do. Maybe, you use a company called AdRoll. You can go ahead and start putting yourself on the internet. You're able to go ahead and really corner these people, so they think that you're the only one who's doing business on that street, on that block, and in that geographic region.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it is vitally important that if you're going to do cold business, that you do have to make it warm by doing direct mail, by doing, door knockers, drops, and all that. So I'd be interested to hear what you say about this to our audience, Ryan. I had a mastermind, this is maybe a couple of years ago, where I was working with, I was talking and communicating with several seasoned agents that work hardcore geographic farms. And they've been doing it for 20, 30 years, like way my senior. And we were talking about what percentage of your GCI do you allocate to marketing? Because mail is expensive. And then just any type of printed material is expensive. But I think the really cool thing about it is no one's doing it anymore, because social media and digital advertising is efficient, and there's some benefit to it for sure. But how much would you ballpark that your percentage of your GCI, you make a $50,000 commission or a $10,000 commission? How much of that are you spending and putting back into marketing?
I'd say about 10 to 12% of my GCI I'm putting back into mailers, digital advertising. It's pretty substantial, and it's super competitive. Like in my area, I've got one guy who's been doing it for 40 years. I got another guy who's been doing it for 30 years. And then I've got people that have lived in that neighborhood, who have their kids going to the schools. And, I'm trying to come in there I'm the youngest person by probably 10, 15 years that actually have some kind of market share. And that's extremely difficult to be able to try to capture that extra market share. But what I've been able to, I think, do most successfully is provide that value in creative new ways that these other agents weren't necessarily open to taking those extra steps. So Compass actually has just started offering something that I think is pretty amazing, which is called Compass Concierge, where we can actually use Compass brokerage dollars to update a property that we would go ahead and exchange, get a listing for, and then we put it on the market. And then at the sale, the seller goes ahead and pays back Compass at a 0% interest rate. So through that, I've been able to create a lot of business because it's saying, hey, you know what, not only am I going to go ahead and sell your house for the top dollar, but I'm going to create you more money that you wouldn't have had anyways by this investment that you're going to make that you might not have made yourself. And then on top of that, I've got my own personal concierge network that I created a while back, which was, I got my vendors, right? So I can go ahead and provide extra value with vendors that they know me, so they have to keep honest in terms of being able to show up on time, being able to execute on the jobs, not delay, because they know that I'm a source of more business for them. So there's a lot of different ways you can create a lot of value in terms of just having a really robust vendor list.
I think that that's incredibly important too, because I think that when you start to become known in a neighborhood or in an area, what ends up happening is you're going to have a lot of people who aren't going to sell, that want to renovate, that want to do some stuff, that want to spruce some things up, and they're contacting you because they get your mailers, then they see it on Facebook, they see it on Instagram or whatever digital, and all of a sudden they're like, hey, Ryan's the guy, he knows, but I'm not interested in selling. And so these are all little auditions. These are little moments where you get the opportunity to say, hey, because someone asks you, hey, who's the guy who does these renovations, or who did that fix and flip? And you have to be ready. You've got to have a solid vendor list, and that vendor list is changing because sometimes someone gets swamped or someone goes out of business or whatever. And so I think that's really a key point. Something else I think is important too, and we've been talking about it a lot, is when you're prospecting someone that you don't have a relationship, the way that you immediately galvanize a relationship very quickly is by value. So I think it's important to talk about when you're on the phone with someone. It could be in person too. It feels a little less cold when you're in person because you at least see them. But when you're on the phone with someone, there is a script. And we talked about this at our 30 Under 30 Mastermind in Charleston, South Carolina. That script's real important. And I think for a lot of these people, if they don't know you, if they don't know Compass, if they don't know whatever your intro is, you've got to get right to the point real quick and be engaging. So real quick, without kind of like role playing the whole thing out, if someone is like, okay, Ryan, Kyle, I'm in. I want to do cold calling, and I'm going to try it out. I'm going to try it in my neighborhood or the neighborhood nearby. So that way, if I make any enemies, I don't have to see them every day. But if someone decides that they want to do that, how do they start a call? And at what point are you trying to put your hook in for your value proposition?
Yeah, right off the start, you have to go ahead and identify who you are. Hey, this is Ryan, Palisades Realtor. I've shortened it up. I've tried every single thing in the bag, right? But Ryan, hey, this is Ryan, Palisades Realtor. Hey, have you considered hearing an offer for your property? Really, really quick. They know the value that you're bringing. They can tell you right off the bat whether they're interested or not. A lot of times you'll get a hang up, but guess what? That's just that much quicker to go ahead on to the next call. But if you do have a hesitation or they do say yes, then you can bust in with all of these next questions. Okay, with that said, what have been some of the updates that you've done to your home? Right? So right off of that segue can go ahead and say, well, we haven't done anything. Oh, well, have you considered maybe doing anything? Because I have a great, robust vendors list of different people. So I can bring value no matter where they go because I'm leading the conversation. So, I mean, the scripts I think are really, really extremely important. And each one of those avenues that you're going to go ahead and lay out with that first question, it's kind of like here's your roadmap. If they're going to say no, they're going to say no anyways. Maybe call them on the wrong day, maybe call them back a week, a month later. But if that person has a hesitation or says yes, you know that roadmap's going to be able to take you down another road that you could provide value. Maybe they don't want to sell that day. I'm never going on the phone thinking that they're going to sell on that day. That's only happened once to me, where it actually worked out and it ended up taking, about 6 months to get that person to finally sell. But I mean, I'm sure, Kyle, you have a lot of experience with this too.
Yeah, I have a broker mentoring class with our newer agents where we talk about this sales strategies and just other general, sales tactics. And one of the big things I share is that when you're on the phone with someone, or heck, if you get introduced to someone at, a neighborhood gathering, your goal is not to sell someone right there. I mean, no one is very rarely has anybody ever pick up the phone and go, gee, yeah, sure, I'm going to sell with this complete stranger. All you're doing is selling a meeting. You're selling an opportunity to get together with them. And then it becomes very similar to anyone that would work a sphere of influence. They're checking you out. They're like, is he legit? And then you're bringing your credentials. You've got a portfolio. You've got some sort of value proposition. Here's the houses I've done. And it becomes easier as you become more and more successful. It's like rolling a snowball down the hill. It starts out little, but then becomes real big as you get to the end. And so I think that for those that are trying to do this, the biggest thing, and to give yourself a break, I would suggest is just, hey, all you're doing is selling an opportunity to meet with someone. That's it. And you've succeeded if you got a meeting set. And so I think just to deconstruct what Ryan did. So Ryan and I both have very intriguing, very kind of tricky last names if you read them. And so sometimes that can work to your benefit. I've got a buddy who's got a pretty kind of generic American name. And he's like, man, I don't like it because it just so blends into everything. And so if you say, hey, this is Kyle Malnati or Ryan Jancula, and all of a sudden you punch right into not the company that you're with, but Pacific Palisades Realtor or Central Denver Apartment Expert, boom. If they hang up within that first 5 seconds, at least you've identified who you are. So when they see the door hanger, when they see the mailer, when they see the Facebook ad, retargeting, whatever it is, they're going to start to associate that with you. And I think one of the big mistakes that people make is that they're thinking that this is going to be, I'm going to make one call and a sale and I'm off and running. This is something that's going to take a lot of time. It may take 15, 20, 30 impressions before someone really starts to believe, okay, like now I get it. You're the guy that's doing stuff. You're working with those different construction crews. You sold my neighbor's house down the street, and becomes easier over time, but you really do need to establish those impressions.
You're starting to create a web. You said it so right. You're starting to create a web to be able to capture, their attention rather than, just thinking, I'm going to pick up the call and try to make a sale on this phone call. I mean, to think like how many solicitors call you on a daily basis, right? Well, we're not solicitors. We're providing an opportunity. I truly believe that because I think that working with me, I think working with my team is an absolute opportunity for that person. Maybe it's not today or tomorrow, but somewhere down the line, I know I'm very confident in the service that I can provide. So if you're really, confident in that, you should know that it shouldn't matter if it's today or in 10 years. That's your business. And you should call up that person and say, hey, how are you doing? Like, and have a conversation with them. Maybe you call two months later, and you don't have to ask them if they're going to sell. What's the chance they're going to sell? They say, you're going to have to carry me out of here, in a casket. Like that person perhaps won't go ahead and want to go ahead and sell, but guess what? Maybe they have a friend down the street who wants to sell, or they have a son or a daughter. So I've had that actually happen multiple times where I've gotten referrals off of cold calls.
Yeah, a great example of referrals. I've had this absolutely happen. Someone in my neighborhood, someone that I would say probably from a peer standpoint, we're on different levels. They moved in, when the neighborhood got started 30 some odd years ago. I do a lot of stuff in commercial real estate, so they don't necessarily see all the things I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, but they knew that I was in real estate, and they knew that they saw me somewhat regularly, and they knew I was successful just based on some of the renovations we were doing on our house. They walked across the street one day and said, hey, I want to just kind of share a story with you that I was talking to the former owner of the house you live in. Remember the person you bought it from? And I'm like, yeah, of course I do. This is like 11 years ago. Well, this person's family situation's changed and they want to sell a vacation home. And they were asking me if I know a realtor that specializes in this area of the mountains in Colorado. And I'm like, I would absolutely love to do that. And all of a sudden, boom, like the sort of sphere of influence, but we're not buddies. We're not like going and drinking beers in the backyard or anything. This guy is way older than me. And it was just one of those things where right place, right time, but also just tons of establishment in the neighborhood network and that web of the newsletters and all the other things and referral. And it was like such a straightforward deal. And it was super cool. Really cool.
Well, and I think what's really important about what you just said is you've lived there for 11 years. I'm guessing you said you lived there for 30. That didn't happen when you moved in, right?
Of
like,
course.
Maybe you gotten other referrals from other neighbors, but But at the same time, like that took 11 years to formulate some kind of business out of it. And that goes back to a point that you asked me earlier, is how long have some of these relationships taken to actually create that business? I mean, I've had certain deals, like my expectations for these cold calls is I'm going to make business off of them in 6 to 18 months, right? And let's talk back to the formula we were discussing, right? So for every cold call, how many contacts are you going to make? For every contact you're going to make, how many people are actually going to be interested in hearing what you have to say? A lead, okay? And then off of those leads, how many appointments? And then really based off of your appointments, how many appointments you meet with face-to-face is going to dictate your sales. So the calls that you make at the beginning, yeah, through the formula, they will dictate how many meetings, but how many sales. But really what matters is how many people are you getting in front of, right? Because it doesn't necessarily matter if it's that person or you're putting, you know, that you're a qualified professional in that person's head and they're going to refer you to someone else.
It's a great, Brian, I love that you segued right into it because it's totally perfect. And a lot of people know about a marketing funnel. And for those of you watching on YouTube, you know, you see the top of the funnel is the big part. And then as you go down, you get the qualified lead at the very end. So many people focus on oh man, I made 300 calls this week and got nothing. Or I made 300 calls and all I got was one appointment. It's like, hey, you got a ratio. Now you know you got to make 300 calls to get an appointment. And of course, you'll get better. You'll qualify your database better, and that'll get better over time. But I think it's so important to talk about ratios. Something that I talk to a lot of my new agents, whether they're working directly with me on my team or whether they're working in my company. And so let's talk about ratios. So for you, just anecdotally, maybe when you started and now where you are as far as how many calls, you know, maybe a call guy, you know, one of the call guys or gals on your team, how many calls are they making to get a contact, first of all, and what's that ratio look like? And then once they get a contact, what's their conversion to get you in the door to meet? Just anecdotally, it doesn't have to be like super specific, but just
it's usually around 1 to 1.5%. So for every 1,000 calls, you're getting maybe 300 people. It really depends on how legitimate the numbers that you're calling. Maybe you're getting 300 people who pick up. Out of those 300 people who pick up, you're getting about 30 people who are somewhat interested in hearing what you have to say. Out of those 30 people that are somewhat interested in what you have to say, you're probably meeting with about 3 of them. And then with those 3 people that you're meeting, between 6 to 18 months, they're going to go ahead and buy or sell or refer you to someone.
And I would imagine you had started this business where you were the call person. Then you got busy enough, then you became notable enough that you start working with some inside sales associates. ISAs is what a lot of people will call them. So again, without getting like super specific on people's names and what they make and stuff, but how do you compensate those folks? How does it work? You know, you close a deal and do they get a piece of it? Are they getting a salary? What does that look like as you're training them with their scripts? Because I think there's a lot of people like, man, this is really interesting. I want to be an ISA or I want to have an ISA someday.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go ahead and incentivize people, but I think that the meetings are the most important part, right? So I incentivize people with a $250 amount for a meeting. It doesn't matter if that person's going to sell tomorrow or if they're going to sell in 10 years. If they're meeting face to face, I'm paying $250 for that meeting. When they're coming in to the office, I'm not paying them hourly. And then once that deal closes, they're getting about 25, anywhere from 15 to 25 to 30%. It just depends on their experience and how much value they're bringing. But how I view it is it's essentially a referral, right? So they're referring me to someone to walk in the door, and no matter if they're selling now or later, I'm creating that relationship with them and making sure that the inside salesperson will get paid. What we've also done is we've also paid people on an hourly basis, and then had quotas for calling, and then also incentivized them for meetings. So it really just depends on what your makeup is. When I started this whole thing out and I brought people on, I didn't have the money to pay people. So I had to incentivize them with, you know, basically percentages off of deals and the promise that I would execute. And it's happened and been extremely successful for some of the people who've been with me for 3 to 4 years.
I think it's a really, really obvious part, but I think we need to talk about this. Real estate is a results-based business. We don't get paid until we are successful all the way through to the closing. And so someone that's working with you's got to understand that, like, hey, and I think it might be a good way to start someone out on a base of like, hey, we get this. This is a proven model. I'm committed to your success. So I'll pay you hourly to make sure you're not doing this for nothing. And I'm not going to take advantage of you. But at the end of the day, they want, if they're good, they want to have the upside of the bigger splits, the bigger portions. And I know a bunch of guys who have, and gals who have teams where they've got people calling under them because they're the name brand in the area, and their people want to get to the point where they're on less of a base salary and more of a promotional bonus as it relates to meetings and actual closings. And I would imagine you've probably seen this in certain markets. You can probably make six figures being an inside salesperson without having to go out to any appointments.
Absolutely, 100%. Coming in, calling for 5 hours, making your 100 to 150 calls, which really I try to get people to make 60 contacts a day. So I don't even care how many calls you make. You call 60 people and you get 60 contacts and leave, that's great, but like the contacts are the thing that really, really matters. But yeah, I think that it can be pretty lucrative, especially in these higher valued markets. It's just they're fewer and farther between, because if you're looking at a $2 million entry price, 25% of that's a $500,000 sale, right? So when you're looking at that in an area that might not be as expensive in price point, the incentive base is a little bit more lucrative in this market.
So I think any business is going to survive, and the lifeblood of any business is going to be the consumer resource database that you're working with. So when it comes to CRMs, but then also just the system, how do you, again, you don't need to say like the specific system, but if you want to share it, but like, how do you get everybody on the same page so that if you got a couple people making calls, they're not calling all over each other, calling the same people. And then also where you get a situation where it's like, someone doesn't feel like they're getting like the primo leads and the other person's getting the dead leads and all that. Like, how do you work with salespeople to make sure that everyone stays on track, everyone stays focused, and you're really curating a database that's valuable? Because if they're making a bunch of calls and no context because the numbers are bad, I would imagine people get frustrated and quit pretty quickly. So how do you just organize this whole thing is basically what I'm trying to figure out.
Well, so it all started from identifying those teardowns. So I went through and I named each property or each neighborhood in my area, right? So I created a giant farm. I created 16 different farms, right? And then I put that on my website too. And I went around and I took aerial photography and I went ahead and I wrote descriptions of each individual neighborhood. And I started branding those different neighborhoods. Then from there, I knew that everyone who was probably the most likely to sell, you can get a laser farm from your local title rep, or what you can do is do what I did and drive the actual neighborhoods so you can really know and pick up the phone and say, hey, you're that house that's 3 houses down from that house with the red roof, right? Yeah. Oh, so you did drive by, so you're not talking like, just out of nowhere. It's like, what you're talking about because you drove those streets, the house, picked out that house, that 5 houses down the developer's building, that he's going to make an offer for this price point, and I can provide you that value right now. And if you don't believe me, let's try it. And if worst comes to worst, hey, at least you're going to know what the value of your house is. You're going to meet a great guy, right? Something like that. And by being able to bring that kind of value to someone, that's going to be with, long lasting. And so going back to your main question, putting those neighborhoods and labeling those neighborhoods, branding those neighborhoods, and then going ahead and putting those into a CRM. I use Mojo Dialer. And through Mojo Dialer, you can do an auto dialing feature if you want to go ahead and pay for it, which we did, which just makes it a little bit easier process because it's much easier than dialing by hand, which I've done before I knew this. And I had to learn all this stuff myself, right, which was extremely difficult when you're starting off.
Yeah, and I've heard there's other sources. I've heard Coal Resource, and there's free. There's a lot of this stuff that's free that you can find people's numbers, and you've got to.
Intellius is one. People Finders is another one. I think Verify Bright is one. I think for emails, I didn't really have too much success with blasting emails. I don't really like that because I feel like that's something that you're literally being able to put something in someone's mailbox. I don't know. That just wasn't really my go-to, but those are just some of the options.
Those are great resources. Well. And I think it's smart that you've identified that, look, doing broadcast emails might not be the thing, because if you're in the business of trying to communicate with people and add value, the more that you hold that information, not like you're trying to be deceitful, but the more you hold it until someone meets with you, the more valuable your exchange is going to be, because it's going to be 3-dimensional. You're going to hear verbal and nonverbal cues. You're going to see their attitude. And that's really what becomes successful. If anybody knows in a listing appointment, when you can get kneecap to kneecap, eyeball to eyeball with the person, that's really where you create business. And in these higher end marketplaces where you've got affluent people, they have a lot of what they want. And it's like buying a birthday present for the person who's got everything that they want. The best thing that you can do is provide them with an experience that they won't get from anybody but you. It's like take them out to this or go somewhere, like go really big if you're using that birthday example. And the thing I like to think about is these really, really connected people, if you've got something they can't have or don't know about, you are like, I mean, it's just easy. It's like, they're going to be eaten out of your hand. And so I think it's important to think as you're creating maybe a business that might have an element of cold prospecting or working by referrals by talking to someone that you're really connected to. But like LinkedIn, this is your second or your third degree contact where that person's kind of cold to you, but they're related through some other connection. So I think it's just important to just think through all this stuff. Ryan, before we end, let's talk about a couple of just major things that you've learned. I know that from my own experiences, making prospecting, dialing people, especially back in the old days where you're literally walking neighborhoods and Google Earth and Google Maps didn't exist, and you're doing it with a map book and you're writing down addresses and taking photos. At least photos were digital. What are some of the funny mistakes you made, and what are just some things that you learning experiences is what my mentor called them, from just kind of like getting out there and putting yourself out there? Because I think a lot of people get bent out of shape about like, oh man, I'm going to say something stupid on the phone. And you do fumble and you're like, oh, and you don't know what to say. And it's like lights, camera, action. So what are some of the funny things that happened that you had to get over pretty quickly?
Well, how I had, multiple people tell me just to, get the, off their lawn, right? From door knocking, or why are you calling me? Like, and what you learn after a while is it's like, maybe that person's having a bad day. I've literally called people where they've said, and screaming. And then I called them, a week later, and they pick back up and they're a completely different person. Hey, how you doing? And they're just really affable. So never assume that because you talk to one person one time, that they're going to be that person forever. That could be the person who's selling the next day. But when I first started out working with my mentor, he told me not to come in the office for the first 8 weeks of, I think it was 2014. He said, don't come in the office until you have some kind of lead or some kind of business. So literally, I door knocked everything. And then that's when I really came up with the idea of saying, okay, I want to identify these teardowns, and then I want to go ahead and cold call them because it's going to be a lot more efficient than door knocking, just because of my time. So I did that, and after calling, I door knocked probably over 1,000 or 1,200 houses. I went back in the office. I created the system. I think I pulled 25 numbers, which you could still pull off public record at that point in time. And I called the first 8 people, and I got my first pickup. And off that pickup, hey there. And I basically went through my whole spiel, and she said, yeah, I actually am looking to sell my house. And I said, oh my God. So I was like going crazy over that. So that ended up being a $1.8 million sale. She then 4 months later sold her $3.2 million sale at that property. I had someone come in, which we double sided. We represented them on the purchase, and obviously we sold the woman's house, right? And then that buyer who bought that property for 3.2, we sold their property, listed it for 1.6. So that whole scenario, right? After door knocking or after cold calling, having people tell you to screw off, it's pretty an amazing feeling to know that you might call 999 people and that next person might be the next one. So just keep doing it. Just keep doing it.
I love it. I got 99 problems. Hey, so the cool thing about it, and you absolutely accentuated this point, is it totally validates all of the other stuff. A dozen weeks of like literally out in the wilderness, you feel like you're in the desert and you're just like, man, I just don't know what I'm doing. But all of that prepares you for that conversation, because whether you think about this or not, there's so much. And I would share, as much as it's good to be efficient with technology and look at things in satellite images. There's nothing that will replace walking a neighborhood. And I don't mean driving a neighborhood, I mean walking a neighborhood, walking it, seeing it, smelling it, hearing the dogs bark, seeing what people do. Like that for me as a geographic farmer and as someone that did a lot of cold calling to start my career and really get to the point where I am today, that was key. I did it every single Sunday, every weekend, because my wife's cousin, who is my mentor as a commercial real estate agent, he's like, here's how I succeed. He's like, you take your weekends outside of the office and you're just walking, go get coffee, go get a drink, go get, lunch or something like that in the neighborhood and really experience it three-dimensional. Okay, two last questions.
Absolutely.
Number one, and this is perfect for our interview because this business is stressful. This process of calling people that don't know you and don't care about you and don't know why you're calling when they're screaming at you and cursing at you, which happens, that can knock you down and it can be really stressful. So what for you, either physically or just mentally, is kind of your happy place? And I'm thinking like Happy Gilmore, like what do I got to do to get back in the zone? What's your happy place? Where do you go to stress?
You know what's great is if you're cold calling and you can look over at someone else who's doing the same thing that you're doing and just say, whoa, like you should have heard what that person just said to me. And then you just start cracking up about it. You crack a joke. I think that is a really, really great thing to have that, I didn't have all the time. When you're out there on your own, you can get down on yourself. But if you do have someone in there with you who's doing it and you can go ahead and rap about it and laugh, like laughter is probably my happy place for sure.
Yeah. And misery loves company. You're like, man, that sucked. And you tell someone, you're like, all right, whatever, we're moving on. And it's just, you got that camaraderie and you've got that esprit de corps and you've got that accountability of like, all right, get back on the phone, man. Like you had a goal of 50 dials today. Where are you? And you're just doing your thing. Okay. Final question. And then we've got to end. And I always hate that we get like, man, we're wrapped up in this and all of a sudden we got to end. I really appreciate your time, Ryan. So what we've got here, the final question is my favorite. I save it to the end. It's based on a song by the band Mercy Me. And it's this idea of Dear Younger Me. So you've had some success. You've had some success nationally, also locally. And what ends up happening is a lot of people think, hey, you just landed on this mountaintop. And for you, I would imagine that now that you've lived some life and you've been there, done that, you probably have some suggestions for your younger self. And so this is the advice you wish you knew when you were 22. You're writing a letter to yourself. You have the ability to go back. You get a DeLorean. You go back to the future. You say, hey, Ryan, here's the secret to success here. What advice would you give to the younger version of yourself?
This is kind of a lame answer, but really, it's like, I don't think I do much different than I did, because really when I went into it, I had, we could talk about this because I'm sure you had the same thing, but like so many ups and downs, so many things that I thought were sureties that didn't end up panning out, relationships that you think are going to turn into something that don't. And through all of that, I just maintained in my mind where I wanted to be at what age, when I want to buy my house, when I want to buy my first investment property, when I want to buy my set. And I focused on that future point of a tangible place where I knew later in life where I could be, that I could achieve. And I knew that as long as I am going in the right direction, and there may be different checkpoints along the way, and there's this road and that road and that road to go down, I know as long as I'm hitting checkpoints, as long as I continue on, then I'm feeling good about myself. So to answer your question, looking back at 22-year-old me, I'd be pretty proud of him. I'd say, at 29 now, you've worked really hard, and you keep working, because you're going to be able to reach every single goal that you want to do if you actually have that consistency and persistency. No one's going to tell me that I'm doing something that is not going to help me reach my goals. Like, I'm going to dictate that myself. So really, to answer your question, I would really just pound down on that and say, hey, 22-year-old me, do not listen to other people. When you know you have a fire inside of you and you drive, just go, 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 go.
I love that. And it's something that a lot of people have talked about. It's a funny little saying, but life is hard by the yard. Life's a cinch by the inch. And I love, if you use, every single one of us in real estate has seen one of the measuring wheels or measuring tape, or, you're working with the renovators, they've got their tape out and they're all segmented by inches or by meters or, whatever denomination you want. My career coach wrote a book that became a New York Times bestseller called Take the Stairs. His name's Rory Vaden. And he had this whole principle of perspective. And he said what he does and what he saw demonstrated is if you take one of those big tape measures and pull it out 80 feet, that is the typical lifespan of someone. You might live to 90 or 75 or whatever, but about 80 years is that typical lifespan. And what's in every single foot, if you've got that 80 feet, is 12 inches to get there, 12 months for every year. And he said what ends up happening is this little blip on the radar, this millimeter, this milli-inch, this whatever, that one thing that messes you up today, it ain't going to mess up those 80 years.
That's so right.
What ends up happening though is if you think about it like, oh man. And so I think if you break up your day, you break up your week, your month, your year, you have these little benchmarks, it makes life so much more palatable because you're really grinding, you're scrapping. So Ryan, I love that answer. I think it's awesome. I wish we had more time. I wish we could talk for 2 hours. We are buddies. We did spend some time together leading a mastermind session in South Carolina. And Ryan Jancula, I just really appreciate your time and your energy. For my podcast producer, Kayla Davis, I'm Kyle Malnati. Thanks for tuning into the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. And as I love to say, we will see you around the neighborhood and we'll make some cold calls. See you, man.
Thank you, Kyle.